And welcome to Sci-Fi Christian. I'm Ben DeBono, here to talk to you today about Paradise Lost Book 7. We enter into the second half of the great poem by Milton. And I'm guessing that if you're reading along here, especially if you're a first-time reader to Paradise Lost or somebody who is relatively unfamiliar or new to epic poetry, that this proved to be the most accessible book so far. That would be my assumption anyway. I think that in many ways this is a fairly straightforward book, and a good part of that is because we are on familiar ground. Now, in a sense, for anybody who is part of Western culture, this whole narrative is familiar territory. Obviously, the fall of Satan, the Adam and Eve, creation, war in heaven, all this good stuff. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to believe any of it to be familiar with this material. It's simply part of our culture. It's part of the cultural consciousness. But at the same time as what I think we've seen, Milton's doing a lot of other things besides just retelling that story. For example, I think the last book is a perfect example of this, in that, okay, it's familiar in the sense that the whole mythology of war in heaven is familiar to our cultural consciousness, but at the same time, so much of what Milton is doing there is referencing Homer and epic battles in previous literatures, which many people are not familiar with and aren't part of our cultural consciousness in the same way that biblical material is, or at least Christian mythology is. So it creates a bit of a stumbling block for us a bit. Where we understand the beats of the narrative, so there's really no surprises for anybody in our culture who has not lived their entire life in a hole in the ground. We all know how book 6 is going to turn out, even if we haven't been paying attention to the previous books that tell us that Satan's going to wind up in hell. But yet, because of how it's told, it kind of throws us for a loop. And I think book 7 isn't like that so much. Here, Milton is more sticking very closely to the Genesis account as he retells the 7 days of creation. And obviously, with many florid details and everything that are beyond what's in the Bible. This is a poetical retelling, but we are on more familiar ground. We're not telling the 7 days of creation by way of Homer this time. We are telling the 7 days of creation by way of Genesis, mostly. So that makes it easier. So I'm assuming that this is an easier book for many of you, and for anybody who is not familiar with this type of literature. And if it is, oh well, congratulations. You made it through 6 tough books and you earned that little respite. So a couple of things here before we get to the actual creation narrative itself. First, we have yet again another invocation of the Muse. I believe this is the final one in Paradise Lost. And this is interesting because, if you remember our previous discussions about the invocations of the Muse, I kind of brought up how in the first one it's like, well, there's this tension because Milton is invoking a Greek god who he later associates with being a demon to help him tell his story. And then later in book 3, when we get the invocation of the Muse, it becomes clear, he uses more heavenly muse, and we kind of talked about how he's very clearly invoking a muse in Christian terms, not Greek mythology terms. And here he kind of brings those two together, where he starts out with, I don't think it's Uranus. Maybe it's Uranus, but it's one of the 9 muses that he invokes. And he starts out calling on her, but then he stops and says, but I'm just using the name. I'm not actually calling on this god. My muse is from heaven. So he kind of does our homework for us and rectifies those two sides that we noticed earlier. He also brings up in the opening paragraphs, I didn't note down the line number, but it's right at the beginning, where he makes mention of half yet remains unsung, speaking, of course, of his poem here. And I think it's important we stop and note the word unsung. This is something C.S. Lewis points out in his preface to Paradise Lost, which, by the way, I would recommend reading even right now. Don't wait till you're at the end of Paradise Lost. If you're reading along with me as these videos come up, go ahead and read Preface to Paradise Lost right here in the middle. You're going to get an enormous amount out of it. It's an excellent resource, very easy to read. But the point Lewis makes, or one of the points Lewis makes in that book, is that the earlier Homeric epics, earlier epic poems, would have been sung. Probably not in their entirety all in one sitting, of course. I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey are quite long. But they were intended to be performed. And in Milton's time, that wasn't the case, but Milton is trying to replicate that similar type of feel with Paradise Lost. He wants to give us the feel of being in an audience, listening to a bard perform this poem, just as Homer would have, and the Homeric audiences would have experienced when those earlier epics would have been sung. So I think that's an important thing to point out and be aware of as we continue to try and immerse ourselves into the poem. Alright, so as we get into the narrative of Book 7, obviously Raphael has just told Adam about everything in heaven, the war in heaven, and before Adam asks him, hey, what about creation? Could you tell me about that? And we get the whole creation narrative. We get this interesting moment, just a few lines long, starting in line 59, where Adam reflects on what he's just heard. And what Milton says is, whence Adam soon repealed the doubts that in his heart arose, and now led on yet sinless with desire to know what nearer might concern him, how this world of heaven and earth conspicuous first began. That's very interesting, because here we have Adam experiencing doubt, but Milton makes it clear that this isn't doubt that leads him to sin. And the more you reflect on this little moment in the book, the more interesting I think it becomes, because it really drives home the gravity of what has just happened. For us, as I was talking about at the beginning, the whole war in heaven is a very familiar thing. And even if that's not, the whole concept of evil and sin is a very familiar thing. Universal concepts, regardless of faith, or even of non-faith. Everybody, the whole concept of morality is part of the human condition. But in Adam's case, if we're to think about Adam as a character in this poem, he has just heard of evil for the very first time. He has just experienced evil for the very first time. And even more significant, he's experienced it while he himself is not evil. Okay, so Adam is sinless at this moment in the poem, and yet he has experienced evil. And you think about that, that's, how that rocks his world in that moment, how shattering and profane that is for this character here in the poem. And I think Milton drives that home very, very subtly, but brilliantly here, where he brings up Adam experiences this doubt, and then there's a moment, Milton seems to be suggesting, where Adam has to choose what to do with the doubts that have arisen as a result of what he has just heard. Now, Milton's text picks up after the choice has already been made. He says Adam repeals the doubts that in his heart arose, but yet that line implies that Adam could have conceivably not repealed those doubts, and then the following line, that he led on sinless, implies that this was almost a moment of temptation for Adam. So this is very, very significant, I think, especially in light of the fact that what he's not supposed to do is eat of the knowledge of good and evil. And in a sense, even though I think that we're supposed to understand that knowledge in the sense of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil isn't an intellectual knowledge, but a deep and experiential knowing. It's still the fact that Adam now has knowledge of good and evil in that intellectual side, and even that proves to be a source of temptation for him. So I find that to be just a very brilliant line there. And then one last thing of note before we get into the creation narrative. Unless I'm mistaken, line 131 is the first time that Satan is referred to as Lucifer in this poem. I think that name has been alluded to a couple times, and I could be wrong on this, but I believe that up till now Milton has not referred to Satan as Lucifer. Where I'm thinking of it being alluded to is in Book 5 when Raphael begins the narrative. He says something about how, he starts referring to him as Satan, and he says something to the effect of, that wasn't his name then, but it is his name now, and that's the name I'm going to use. Obviously, it's much more poetically written than my rough paraphrase, but there you have it. So, again, I could be wrong on that. I didn't double check it, but certainly interesting, because even if it has been used before now, that name is very rarely used in the poem, or at least has been up until this point. So I find some significance there. All right, into creation. Well, before we get to the 6 days of creation in Raphael's narrative, the place Raphael starts is very, very interesting, because Raphael seems to imply that the creation of earth and humanity is directly a result of Satan's fall. Okay, so this is line 139 and going through line 161. And this is the Father, this is God speaking to the Son here at this point. So Raphael's telling the narrative again, but he's giving us the words of God to the Son. So, God says, "At least our envious foe hath failed, who thought all like himself rebellious, by whose aid this inaccessible high strength, the seat of deity supreme, us dispossessed, he trusted to have seized, and into fraud drew many, whom their place knows here no more. Yet far the greater part have kept, I see, their station. Heaven yet populous retains, number sufficient to possess her realms, though wide, and this high temple to frequent with ministries, due and solemn rites." In other words, Satan took a lot of people with him, or angels with him, but even more of them are here. We're still doing good, right? But, and this is where the significant part begins, but least his heart exalt him in the harm already done to have dispeopled heaven, my damage fondly deemed. I can repair that detriment, if such it be to lose self-lost, and in a moment will create another world out of one man, a race of men innumerable there to dwell, not here till by degrees of merit raised they open to themselves at length the way up hither, under long obedience tried, and earth be changed to heaven and heaven to earth. One kingdom, joy and union without end. Okay, so obviously we he turns away from the point we're going to focus on, and we get that kind of beautiful moment of God's vision for humanity, which really drives home Milton's poetic powers. But I want to back up a little bit, because I mean that's kind of a disquieting note there, right? That Satan's down, and we don't, even though he didn't take that many people with him, we don't want him to get too excited about what he did accomplish, so I'm going to make this planet, this people, we're going to do creation. It's almost like God wants to, stick in the knife a little bit here to Satan, and we're his way of doing it. There's a couple ways you could take this, or a couple ways you could go with this. I mean, first you could just say that it's just Milton fleshing out God's motivation, the logical chain of events that leads to creation. You could look at it as further evidence that Milton's God is not the most friendly and warm and wonderful person out there. That he seems a little petty in this moment, right? Satan took some of mine, but look what I'm gonna do. Or you could almost take it as that this is meant to be a counterpoint to what we saw Satan do earlier, where Satan wants to go and seize humanity and corrupt humanity to kind of get back at God. And now we get this other side of that where, well, but God created humanity in the first place to get back at Satan. So is this almost a continuation of the war in heaven? Is that how we're supposed to then see the existence of humanity in this poem and creation and all the other events? Is this continuing to be God versus Satan? And then what does that say about who the ultimate victor of this poem is? So make of that what you will, but certainly a very significant moment there. And then we get into Genesis 1. Couple of things about reading this. First of all, if you are at all part of American Christianity, you know just what a contentious bit of the Bible Genesis 1 is. I think what we have to do here, especially since the rest of this book is so familiar and so accessible to us, we need to be very careful not to export modern debates, modern views onto the text in Paradise Lost. Okay? So whatever you believe about Genesis is irrelevant to what Milton is doing here. Okay? Whatever you think, whether you are six-day creationist, whether you're old earth person, I don't care. It doesn't matter for what Milton is doing in the poem at this moment. And there's a high temptation to, read into this. Well, where's Milton going to come down on the whole debate? Well, don't ask that question, because it wasn't a question Milton would have been asking. There was no debate back then. This was a non-issue. Nobody thought in those terms that we think in today. Make of that what you will. But it's simply meaningless to export modernist categories onto a pre-modern text, which is what this is. And make no mistake about it, all of our debates about Genesis are firmly grounded in modernist understandings, but not postmodernist understandings. So if we're to really enter and experience the world of this poem, we need to very consciously lay all of that aside and take Milton on his own terms. And we're going to find that even though this is so familiar, it's also a highly mythologized and highly poetic version of the poem. So trying to read into it, is Milton older or younger, is pointless, because this is not scripture. It is not a textbook. It is not a stance in a debate. This is poetry. Maybe more than any other part of this poem, and I know this sounds ridiculous to say, but this is pure poetry. Milton is stretching his poetical powers to their limits here as he describes the grandeur of creation. He wants us to revel in it, not to pick it apart to find out where he lands in some debate that he preceded by a good 200 to 300 years. Okay? Okay. So we find that, he does have this highly mythologized version of it. I think this is fascinating, where, starting in line 211, he says, "They viewed the vast and immeasurable abyss, outrageous as a sea, dark, wasteful, wild, up from the bottom turned by furious winds and surging waves, as mountains to assault heaven's highest, and with the center mixed the pole. Silence, ye troubled waves, and thou deep peace, said then the omnific word. Your discord end, nor stayed, but on the wings of cherubim, uplifted in paternal glory rode, far into chaos, and the world unborn, for chaos heard his voice." Now this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because on the one hand, obviously he's playing off of Genesis 1:1, or Genesis 1:2, the face of God hovered over the waters of the deep, and so we get that moment there of the Word of God speaking in and beginning creation, taking those primordial waters that we're greeted with in the opening of Genesis and doing something with them. So there's that. But then there's also Milton's own mythology within the poem, where I remember that chaos is personified in this poem. Satan crosses chaos, and so chaos is not just a metaphor here, it's a very literal thing within the world of Paradise Lost. And then he's drawing on other creation myths, and then he's drawing on his own poetic abilities. So there's a lot going on here within this text. I think right there at the beginning, we get that. So how do we read then the rest of this great poem of the 7 days of creation? Well, first I think it's important to note that Milton retains the structure of Genesis 1. You know, there was evening, there was morning the first day, and he retains that sort of rhythm that goes with Genesis 1. So I would suggest, just like I suggested with the last book, that we ought to read this as liturgy. Okay? This is a liturgical moment. We are, and again, that doesn't mean you have to read Genesis 1 that way, but within the world of Paradise Lost, Milton is drawing us into the liturgy of creation. He's drawing us into the mythology of Christian belief. He's drawing us into revelry and awe and worship at the grandeur of what happens in that moment. It is a liturgical moment. You could almost read most of this book as a chant. You know, reading it reminded me of at the Easter Vigil for Catholics, at least at the two I've been to, the lines from Genesis are read, and it's very beautiful the way that it's done, or it's been done in my parish, where the day's events are read, and then it's chanted or sung that there is evening and there is morning the first day, and God saw that it was good, and this becomes a liturgical refrain as we at the Easter Vigil remember the work of creation. We remember what God, the text and what God has done there. And Milton was recreating that liturgical moment here. And if you've never experienced the Genesis story read in a liturgical context, I think that might be difficult to see. I wish there, maybe there's something out online of video of the Easter Vigil or something you could look up to kind of get a feel for what this is. But if you have experienced Genesis being read in a liturgical context, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That Milton is drawing us into liturgy. It is the only way to understand what's going on here. Okay? So I'm actually not going to dwell a ton on the text of the creation story, because I think unlike the liturgy of Book 6, this is fairly straightforward. I think I would encourage you to not pick it apart, but again, to let it wash over you, let it yourself experience it, read it, and just feel the rhythm of the text. It's very much there. And you just abandon yourself to that. Don't worry about trying to understand every word or look up every footnote, if you're reading an annotated edition. Just let the text flow. That's the way to enjoy Book 7. So, with that said, just a couple other things to mention here. That the interdiction is once again repeated about the knowledge of good and evil during this narrative. I think it's fascinating how Milton keeps bringing that up in every single book since we first are introduced to Adam and Eve. He finds a way to bring up the interdiction. Bring it up, bring it up. We aren't allowed to ignore it. We aren't allowed to forget it. So the way that he says it here, starting in line 542, but of the tree which tasted works knowledge of good and evil, thou mayest not. In the day thou eatest, thou diest. Death is the penalty imposed. Beware, and govern well thy appetite, lest sin surprise thee, and her black attendant death. And there again we have we'll remember that sin and death are also personified, as we saw at the end of Book 2, when Satan makes his escape out of heaven, or out of hell. All right, so that's it for Book 7. I believe this was a little bit shorter this week, which is understandable given that it's a bit of an easier book. I trying to remember if book 8 is where the fall actually occurs. I think we might be there, either 8 or 9. We're getting close to the real action of Paradise Lost. So I hope you're enjoying the poem. I hope you're enjoying the videos and that they're helpful to you as you're reading this poem. They're certainly helpful to me to do and prepare for my own reading. And I'm looking forward to being back with you sometime next week for book 8. But for now, I'm Ben Bono. This is the Sci-Fi Christian.